Even during the preschool years, children begin to encounter many situations in which they want to compare things that require them to use certain measurement skills. Young children are constantly measuring things as they compare how big things are, how tall, how much they have, how far something went, how old they are compared to someone else, how heavy things are, constantly in situations with their friends and as they play with materials, they think about using measurement skills and measurement concepts. While we still have a lot to learn about children's development of measurement concepts and skills, this work began long ago with Piaget. He showed that children's intuitive concepts of quantity, volume, weight, and length are really different from those of older children and adults. Although certain controversies about how children develop measurement skills continue to persist and the age that they can comprehend different skills, right now we know a lot more about children's basic understanding in this area that we need to apply to our teaching. As in other mathematics content areas, it's important that teachers not underestimate young children's capabilities and as a consequence limit their learning. So in thinking about measurement, there's certain steps that kids go through in the comprehension of measurement. And really thinking about an effective teaching sequence for measurement skills is important so that children have some earlier skills before moving on to more complex activities. So first, thinking about that, first children need to recognize that an object has a measurable property, and they need to know what's meant by how long or how heavy. Whatever characteristic they need to measure, they need to understand that that exists, and then they can make comparisons between these objects, such as which one is longer or which one's shorter. Once they're able to do that, they can determine an appropriate unit for the process of measurement and figuring out what's the best way to determine which one is longer or shorter. And then after doing that, they can move into standard units of measurement, such as inches, pounds, centimeters. And then they'll create and use formulas to help count units. So teachers of young children should primarily promote mastery of the first two steps. First, understanding and recognizing that objects have measurable properties, and then how to compare and use comparative language. And then you can begin to plan some activities that encourage exploration of units of measurement. And children typically progress through the last two steps in elementary school. We often jump right into using rulers to measure, but really without a basic understanding of measurement processes, we can really have a negative impact on children's long-term understanding of these concepts. So now let's take a look at each of the ways that we can compare objects using different forms of measurement. First, length and area. Obviously, linear measurement typically receives the most emphasis in the early grades. And for young children, length concepts such as how long or how high something is or how far something went have pretty practical applications. Kids tend to use rulers, measuring tapes, or meter sticks that have numerical measurements for length. Area concepts are a little more difficult for children because those concepts require that children look at more than one dimension. They need to look at length and width or height. Next, let's move on to capacity and volume. While capacity and volume do not receive as much emphasis as linear measurement in early childhood classrooms, they really have a lot of meaningful everyday applications. Capacity often refers to liquid measurement and describes the maximum amount that can be held in a container. Young children often explore capacity when they're playing in the sensory table, for example. And volume is the space that's occupied by a three-dimensional object. Although young children do not yet use numerical measurements for determining capacity or volume, teachers can introduce common terms such as a liter, a pint, a gallon, a cup in the context to describe something children see daily, such as a gallon of milk or when they're cooking. It's important that they at least understand or have exposure to the names of common measures of volume. Another way teachers can promote understanding of capacity and volume is to provide more opportunities for children to measure them at the sand and water tables, and sometimes asking questions about what they're doing, how many can fit, and looking at the different measurements available. Weight is determined by the mass of the object and the effect of gravity on that object. For young children, the comparison of objects to see which one is heavier or lighter should be the primary focus. That's about as much as children can understand. Balances provide good measuring tools for comparison. If we know that this rock is heavier than this rock, then it weighs more, and one side of the balance will go down. Scales allow children to put a numerical value on weight, and this can come after they understand heavier and lighter as more basic concepts. Next, looking at time. Because time concepts and measurement are very difficult for young children, teachers really shouldn't emphasize time measurement in the early years. It can become too complex. What we can do is begin to think about the simple ideas related to time and within their everyday routines, and just have conversations with children about time, age, times of day such as morning, afternoon, evening, night, relational words such as what's going to happen soon, what'll happen tomorrow, what happened yesterday. You can use things to describe a single day like early, or if we're going late, or something that's a long time ago, what happened before something else. This type of language, these relations that kids have with time, are enough at this point for them to think about and are complex enough just to understand what sort of comes first and what comes second and what happened earlier and what can happen later, and how different speeds of objects affect the time that it takes them to complete something. Then there are specific duration words that children use with clocks and watches, such as minutes, seconds, and hours, as well as calendar terms. This is more complicated and really should be reserved until children are developmentally ready for that. While we can teach kids to memorize certain things or know the patterns of numbers on the calendar, truly understanding the scope of time and how it's organized in our calendar can be very hard for them. So providing concrete representations of time passing, such as a sand timer or an egg timer, will help children get a sense of how long a period of time is and give them some clear expectations. Often you'll hear teachers saying, well, we have 5 more minutes to clean up. Well, for most children, that really doesn't make a lot of sense for them. They don't know exactly what 5 minutes is. They haven't had a ton of experience with it. Working with the calendar gives children the opportunity to understand things like yesterday, today, tomorrow, next week. And you can discuss recent and upcoming events such as birthdays and holidays. And kids at first might just use general terms of comparison and thinking about that something is long away or is coming up soon. And that's probably about as enough in thinking about the calendar right now. Temperature should also be taught in the context of young children's worlds. Terms like hot, warm, cold, and freezing are temperature words that may describe the temperature of food, weather, or even how children's bodies feel. Thermometers can be thought of as vertical timelines, so children around the age of kindergarten can begin to understand temperature a little bit more clearly. Obviously, children living in cold areas understand when temperatures are below freezing. They know what that feels like. Just as well as children living in hot areas understand firsthand what it means to be, say, over 100 degrees. Again, measurement vocabulary used in this context is critical to children's understanding of temperature, and you should introduce the vocabulary as much as possible so comparisons can be made, but don't expect children to understand all of this terminology or the specific numbers associated with it. And the last area of measurement we're going to talk about is conservation. When a child conserves length, to use Piaget's term, he or she knows that even if an object changes shape, for example, a pipe cleaner can be bent, its length is the same. Children will understand that water will be the same regardless of the container that it's in. At some point, they're going to understand that just because a container is taller does not mean that it holds less than a container that is shorter and wider. So really beginning to think about the property of matter is conserved regardless of the container that it's in or the shape that it holds. We know that children develop these concepts of conservation by participating in and reflecting and talking about measurement activities that they participate in the classroom.